Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the second day of the conference on the macro-financial impacts of climate change and the net zero transition, jointly organized by Banca d'Italia and the Bank of England. Let me start by thanking yesterday's speakers for their insightful presentations and discussions. The first day of the conference has provided a comprehensive background on how climate is evolving, how its effects propagate through the economy, and what are the implications of the decarbonization process. I will now try to summarize some of the key points that have emerged from the presentations in order to set the basis for today's discussion. The risks associated to climate change have been analyzed from different angles. The direct risks are multifaceted, including not only those related to the destruction of physical capital, but also the spread of new diseases, social discontent due to impoverishment of certain areas, the loss of biodiversity, for example, of pollinating species serving agriculture, and related psychological effects. All these risks can be mapped into economic risks. Research using historical data has quantified the impact of climate change on economic activity. Global climatic trends affect the economies through, for example, higher and more volatile local temperatures. Estimates reveal that extremely hot days reduce households' income and firms' output, even in urban areas and in non-agricultural sectors. Temperatures act mainly through reducing labor supply and productivity, particularly in jobs that require spending time outdoors. In the long run, while the share of workers at risk might contract in developing countries, occupations in which exposure is unavoidable cannot and will not disappear. Temperature impacts on workers will remain significant, even in the United States, despite a gradual adaptation to the evolving climate. Natural disasters, as hurricanes or floods, will also become more frequent and intense due to climate change. Differently than extreme temperature events, disasters have catalyzed huge amounts of public resources to support the healthcare system and to rebuild damaged infrastructures. We saw that these events had peculiar and sometimes surprising implications for labor supply and mortality in certain areas. Arresting climate trends starts from a decarbonization of the economy. Substituting fossil fuels with renewables for power generation, for transportation and heating entails electrification of these processes, which requires a huge investment and technological breakthrough. Among the risks related to the transition, a key risk, besides that of stranded assets, is that of low energy security. Wind and solar sources are intermittent and not uniformly distributed within countries. Assessing their long-run availability, taking into account climate change, is challenging. This makes the evaluation of how much energy storage will be needed and how much it will cost as heroic. The net zero transition can have distributional consequences across economies, as single countries' policies are tied to their role in global energy trade. In scenarios in which policies to reduce emissions are implemented, trade of fossil fuels collapses dramatically. Fossil fuel importers have obvious incentives to decarbonize faster than exporters. The most severe implications are suffered by uncompetitive producers, those with high costs of fuel extraction, while more competitive ones will increase their market share and keep producing during the transition period. The financial sector is not immune from the implications of an evolving climate. intermediaries are threatened by natural disasters via their customers, and from transition risks through the assets in portfolio. This obviously has repercussions on economic activity, as banks may decide to divert funding away from entire sectors or geographic areas. Survey evidence suggests that large intermediaries have pessimistic expectations about the evolution of temperatures, and while they have serious reputational concerns, active climate risk management is limited at best. Asset prices also contain information on how investors perceive climate risks. We saw that home prices in some coastal areas of the United States embed a premium to compensate for the risk of inundation due to sea level rise. This is not just the case of home prices. Other papers show, for example, that the cost of protection from downside price variations is larger for carbon-intensive securities and increases when public attention to climate does. As information on climate risks and sustainability provided by the market is still incomplete and sometimes incoherent, supervisors can have a role to speed up the process of standardization of information. For example, regulating firm sustainability disclosure. Yesterday's presentations have given a flavor of how far-reaching are the implications of climate change and the net zero transition, and of how much research still needs to be carried out to answer the many existing open questions. Today, we continue to dig into the interaction between climate change and the economy, but from a policy perspective. Next session, session number 3, will explore how policies implemented by different authorities can interact with climate and the economy. The speakers will cover the design of optimal policy instruments, how they affect technology and market neutrality, and what repercussions a delay in climate policy implementation might ignite. Session 4, the last one of the conference, is structured as a panel discussion. Here, policymakers at central banks and international financial institutions sit at the same table with academics to discuss how research findings can fit a real-world policy. The discussion is introduced and moderated by Ignazio Visco, Governor of Banca d'Italia. Session 4 aims at providing elements to form a unified view on climate action across institutions, and at giving insights on how they can interact and exploit synergies to fight climate change. As fiscal, monetary, and international authorities have successfully joined forces to support the world economy during the pandemic, this cooperation should be maintained and reinforced to face the longer-run climate challenge. Let me now leave the floor to Ivan Faiella, who will chair session 3 on climate policies. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Filippo, and welcome to you all. As Filippo has mentioned, we are moving from the effects and the impacts of climate change to the policy, what we have to do. These policies are sometimes the mitigation policies, and the thing that is going to be explored by Elmar Kriegler, what kind of technology adoption we are imagining, what kind of mitigation policies we want to implement. But then it's also relevant the design, and Carolyn Fischer of these policies, and Carolyn is going to speak about that. So let's start with the first part of the session. In the next part, we're going to have Barrage on technology adoption, and Monika Piazzesi that is going to explore a different kind of policy that are it's a bit less analyzed. No? how monetary policy can help in achieving the transition. So let's start with Elmar. Elmar Kriegler is head of the research department in transformation pathways at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and professor for integrated assessment of climate change at the Faculty of Economics and Social Science at the University of Potsdam. Elmar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, fantastic. So if you can start sharing your screen, and you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thanks.
So, oops, that's the backup slides, sorry.
Don't worry.
So can you see my slides in full screen mode?
Yes, fantastic.
Very good. So thanks a lot for inviting me to present at this exciting workshop. And the task I was given was to talk about the economic impact of delays in climate policy and the variation in climate policy tools. So I only skimmed the surface of this very large topic and will focus on the question of delaying climate policies and the challenges this brings for reaching long-term climate targets. So the literature has firmly established that delaying climate policy strongly exacerbates the challenges to keep warming limited to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And there are three elements to this. The first one is that a warming limit implies a finite carbon budget that we need to stay within. So the CO2 emissions of every year accumulated over time, and at some point this accumulation needs to stop, and we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions. That is only one part of the story. There's also the second part, that is that we also need deep reductions in other greenhouse gases, particularly methane. And I'm not talking about the second part of the story, but I just want to mention it here because it is important to keep in mind that reaching net zero CO2 alone is not sufficient to limit warming. We need these very strong reductions in methane as well and other short-lived climate forces. So due to the fact we have this limited carbon budget, a delay in climate policy leading to higher emissions in the near term depletes our budget faster. And so we need to, at some point, reduce more rapidly after a period of weak action, which introduces abrupt shifts in reduction rates, prices, investment flows at the point where we switch from moderate to really very stringent action. So that's the first element, how delaying climate policy exacerbates this challenge to stay below 1.5 to 2 degree warming. The second challenge is that, of course, as we don't put climate policies in place today, or only weak climate policies, we continue the buildup of fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly in those regions that are rapidly developing right now. And that makes it much harder to switch the path later. And we have more committed emissions, we have more fossil fuel assets, leading then increasing the risk of stranded assets if you want to switch abruptly to towards limiting warming to 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the third element here is that excess emissions in the early periods may require deployment of net negative CO2 emissions to return warming to levels that were originally targeted. Like if we exceed 1.5 degrees and want to return later to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, this might require hundreds of billions of tons of net, so-called net negative CO2 emissions, which basically means that the amount of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere by humanity is larger than the residual CO2 emissions put into the atmosphere. These so-called carbon dioxide removal technologies, or CDR, are little researched, come with their own risks, And also their potential of reversing warming is little known. So this is a highly risky strategy that we put ourselves in if we delay climate policy to increase our reliance on these carbon dioxide removal strategies in the long run. Now, let me take a look back and look at the emissions, how they have developed over the past 40 years. And what you can see here is that emissions, these are global carbon dioxide emissions, they have risen with some short interruptions quite significantly, particularly in the last 20 years. Much of that owed to the development of China and the large energy demand this has been accompanying this, and large expansion of coal-fired power in China and other emerging economies. So we have emitted cumulatively about 1,000 gigatons CO2 between 1992 and 2020 in these 30 years. And I take the year 1992 as a starting point here because that is the year where the Earth Summit in Rio took place and where the United Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed by the vast majority of countries, and it's Article 2 stating the goal, the overarching goal of the convention to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system is still the basis for climate policy today. So since then, since this was agreed, we emitted almost 1,000 gigatons of CO2. Now, if you compare this with the remaining carbon budgets we have now, starting in 2020, and to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with a 50% likelihood, you can see it's between 400 to 500 gigatons CO2, depending on the likelihood. This is a median estimate. There's large uncertainty to it. So that's almost only half of what we emitted over the past 30 years. And so looking forward, what our options are, we need to reduce rapidly, steeply, dramatically down to net zero. And you can see this with the green trajectory here. That's about 500 gigatons. It's 30 years until net zero. So the past 30 years, we emitted 1,000 gigatons. The next 30 years, we only can emit 500 if we manage. And the picture also immediately makes clear if we delay further and if we stabilize emissions at this level, and that would roughly be the outcome of implementing the current climate plans by countries, the so-called nationally determined contributions, then you can see this becomes all but impossible. And looking back, and that's my last point on this slide, is if we would have acted on the 1.5 degree warming limit at the time the United Nations Framework Convention was agreed upon in 1992, we would have had about 100 years for this transition to net zero. Now we have only 30 years left. And I'm saying this because I would like to make the point that we are already in a situation of delay. We are looking back at 30 years of very weak climate policies. And so we need to grapple with this in the next 30 years to come. Now, the IPCC, in its special report on 1.5 degrees, has put some numbers on this general statement. So what I'm saying now is not qualitatively not so different from what I have said in the stylized graph. So here you can see an assessment of the literature on 1.5 degree pathways. The one funnel I would like to focus on at the moment is the one in blue. So these are pathways that still manage to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot. They reach net zero around 2050. And that's compared to 2075 for 2 degrees. Slide is a bit confusing here. It's 2050, but you can also see a larger spread in this net zero year. But importantly, they also reduce emissions dramatically already until 2030, from now above 50 gigatons down to 25 to 30 gigatons CO2 equivalent, including also other greenhouse gases. This is compared with the gray funnel of pathways that delay climate action. And you can see that there are higher emissions until 2030 following the NDCs. So we end up with emission levels of today's level in 2030. And so these pathways then reduce dramatically afterwards, showing the disruptiveness and abruptness in these pathways. But also the IPCC stated clearly this will no longer be sufficient to limit warming to 1.5 degrees without large overshoot, without this large-scale use of these carbon dioxide removal strategies. Now, very quickly, and do this very short, what is the strategy to reach net zero to limit warming to 1.5 degree? Qualitatively, this is not so different between pathways that limit warming to 1.5 and pathways that limit warming to 2 degrees. The difference is the time. We have 20 years less left for 1.5 than for 2 degrees, which makes a lot of a difference. So you can see the three components here of CO2 emissions. In gray, the emissions from fossil fuels and industrial processes, so mostly from the energy sector and then also from the cement industry. In brown, the emissions from the land use sector, so AFOLU is an acronym standing for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And then there's this yellow component in this particular pathways where carbon dioxide removal is used. So you can see it's used significantly. And if you look at the strategy, it is peaking as quickly as possible. Basically, the model is forced to not reduce before 2020 because that hasn't happened so far. It needs to shift investments from fossils to low carbon and efficiency solutions. Sorry, this is on the slide. This has been removed the text. And the first phase then after 2020 is particularly to decarbonize the power sector. So this needs to go first. Also coal phased out in other sectors of the economy. And at the same time, the electrification of end users is to be progressed to achieve this steep emissions reduction in this period. When we reach around 2050, where it's a time to achieve net zero CO2, we need to grapple with some decarbonization bottlenecks, for example, for aviation and shipping and heavy industry. So there can be carbon neutral fuels being used here. There can be hydrogen being used here, but also carbon removal from the atmosphere can already be used to substitute or neutralize some of these residual emissions, as happens in these particular pathways. And in the long run, then there's a larger share of these carbon dioxide removal technologies. But most importantly, the major element of this strategy is to reduce emissions, to phase out fossil fuels, and to increase energy efficiency, to electrify the energy sector, and to move to sustainable land use management that can effectively reduce agricultural emissions and also store carbon in the ground or on land rather than in the atmosphere. Now, if you look at the current plans on fossil fuel infrastructure, there are a number of studies that show that already the existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure, and this is not only coal-fired power plants or fossil fuel-fired power plants, but also other fossil fuel infrastructure in other sectors, for example, refineries and heavy industry installations. Already these existing and planned emissions commit us to about cumulatively 400 to 700 gigatons CO2 if we run them as long as currently these installations are run. So there would be no early retirement, no reduction in utilization rates. Then we are already exhausting the 1.5 degree carbon budget that I showed on the initial slide. So that already tells us about the scope of the challenge and the economic implications the transition will have, because it indicates that without some early retirement, some lower utilization of the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and without canceling existing plants, particularly in the power sector when it comes to coal-fired power plants. So that's the biggest gap here. Without doing this 1.5 degree limit will be exceeded. Now, this brings us to this notion of emissions gap you probably have heard about. So there is an emissions gap between what we have currently committed to in terms of plants and existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and what we have committed to in the so-called national determined contributions. These are the plans by countries that they submit under the Paris Agreement for 2030, where they state these are our emissions reduction targets, these are our mitigation goals. Sometimes these plans are a bit weak on policy proposals to actually achieve the targets there. So there's also an implementation gap. It's not clear how countries want to achieve their collective commitment. But the second thing is that there's an emission gaps between the outcome of the collective commitment in the NDCs and where we would need to be in 2030 in order to manage this transition to likely below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. What you can see here is a study we did 2 years ago where we looked at the dependence of this emissions gap and how to bridge it on both the climate target and the carbon dioxide, the availability of carbon dioxide removal. So in black, you see a typical trajectory that would emerge under the NDCs until 2030. So basically a stabilization of current emissions. This is an improvement over baseline trends without climate policy. You would see emissions continue to rise. So NDCs do make a change, but it's too small of a change in order to get us close to where we would need to be. Then you see in red a cost-effective pathway that would start off in 2020 to reduce rapidly in order to reach in this case, the 2-degree target. And we can do the same exercise if we have more limited carbon dioxide removal availability, which is a safe assumption, which I think is an important assumption to make because of the risk attached to carbon dioxide removal strategies. And you can see that already both the cost-effective pathways reduces emissions more strongly, as well as the abrupt trend break in these black NDC pathway where the strategy switches from only moderate action to rapid action increases as well. And finally, there is this pathway where we try to reach 1.5 degrees, and that goes through net zero at around 2050, as indicated by the IPCC assessment. Without this very limited carbon dioxide removal potential, we find almost no solution here. So the basic message also coming out of the IPCC report is that carbon dioxide removal to a limited extent will be needed to reach 1.5 degrees. Now, how can this gap be bridged, given the fact that it would be so costly and so challenging to really allow us to not reduce emissions until 2030 compared to today's level significantly. And so what we did in this study, we looked into a number of policy packages, mostly regulatory policies, like renew. So some of the on the fossil fuel side, where it was about phasing out fossil fuels, and that's a restriction on new coal and gas powered plants, upscaling of industry CCS as options. But most importantly, and this is written in the last bullet point, the scenarios also assumed a moderate carbon price. Carbon price is critically important for every strategy because it is needed to phase out fossil fuels. So pushing in new technologies is good, but in order to achieve the maximum benefit from this, there needs to be a carbon price to effectively phase out fossil fuels. So you can see the other policies that we assumed, energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy provisions, electric vehicle mandates, and these kind of things. And what we found is that this could indeed reduce emissions by up to 10 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2030. So bringing us closer to the cost-effective pathway, but at at no small effort, because those regulatory policies are stringent and they are rolled out globally. That's the assumption in the scenario, which is, of course, a very heroic assumption. Now, looking at these pathways, you can look at carbon prices, and now coming a bit to the economic impacts of these different trajectories here. You can look at carbon prices in 2050, which is a good proxy of the overall stringency of the abatement effort that you have to leverage via these pricing trajectories. And you can see that the carbon price is a function of the near-term action. So look at the left column where you have action according to the NDCs until 2030, and then trying to reach the target. And you can see that these are significantly higher, particularly if you don't have carbon dioxide removal available to a large degree, than if you would act immediately. And the other thing that is noticeable is, of course, that the more stringent the target, the higher the price. So we easily reach up to prices of about $500 per ton CO2 in 2050. If you look at the investments, same study still, and see what what investments in the power sector look like in these pathways, you can see for the NDCs in black that the reduction of investments into fossil-fired power plants is only very small. So the NDCs are really not making a big change to the fossil fuel sector. They stay away from it. And they make some provisions to increase investments into renewable energies. This is very different from what you see in a cost-effective pathways, where you would see a strong reduction of investment into fossil fuel power plants, and also a strong increase of investments in low carbon alternatives. So this in-between strategy using the regulatory policies is kind of mediating between these two cases. So you can see there is already a stronger reduction in fossil fuel investments, which is due to the moderate carbon pricing there and other provisions. And then there is also a stronger investment into renewable energy due to these new technology provisions in the package. So strengthening action using mixes of policies is critically important at this point to avoid putting us in a situation in 2030 where 1.5 degrees is basically out of reach. Now, the last element of my presentation is to look at the dimension of these challenges. I already showed a few indicators here. One is the trend break in emissions reduction rates that you saw from the plots. The other one is the shift in investments and how rapidly this would need to change. And so we came up with a categorization of these challenge indicators into these 5 types. Disruptiveness, so really how, or abruptness, I might better say, how rapidly things have to change from, a trend have to change from here to there. The speed of the transition, the overall speed, the scale, deploying a lot of carbon dioxide removal technologies comes with its own risks. For example, using a lot of land for bioenergy comes with its own risk. The distributional impacts and models have been quite weak in this area, but there's increasing work on really looking into the distributional impacts. This is, of course, critically important. I will not be able to go into this during my presentation. And then, of course, the efficiency of the strategy. If it's too expensive, society will have problems to go through. And you can see this profile of these, or the implementability or risk profile of these various strategies in this radar plot. I think it's maybe a bit complex, 2 minutes before the end of my talk to go through that in detail. But what you can see is that we used various indicators to try to pin down these challenges. Some of them economic related. So there's CO2 price jumps, food price jumps at the bottom, consumption losses. We also looked into stranded assets in the fossil fuel power sector. And the basic message is that if you put in these additional policies, you can lower the risk profile by some extent, but you cannot avoid it completely. And comparing this across the other 2 strategies, these indicators show higher risk levels if you have very limited availability of carbon dioxide removal, and also if you go to 1.5 degrees, which is a very ambitious target at this point. So let me now wrap up with this my presentation. I focused very much my presentation on this study, but I would like to take a step back from that and say, okay, we are now at a quite important moment for climate policy for various reasons. But the importance of the moment is further elevated by the COVID-19 pandemic, because this shock has led to a reduction of emissions, but that's only a temporary reduction. And we are already seeing the rebound, and we are feeling it in prices in the energy sector already. This is, of course, problematic for climate policy when people try to invest again into fossil fuels to ease this current price hike. And it also shows the bifurcation point we have now. If the stimulus packages we put in place to revive our economies, to grapple with the aftermath of the pandemic, is going back to the old economic model and investing in brown and carbon-intensive activities, we will exactly get what I was showing here as problematic, which is only moderate climate action, high emissions for the next decade, locked into fossil fuel infrastructure, and then we will lose the 1.5 degree target. So this is a pivotal moment to really look also in the stimulus packages, how to make sure that the investment, that the opportunity, because there's also an opportunity, these high investments now being leveraged, to invest in green and transitional technologies, and some of them I mentioned during my presentation. I'm wrapping up with two comments. One is that we have done work with scenario work for the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, and these scenarios, and probably you all know them, are located in such a matrix that was designed by the NGFS. It includes also a delayed transition scenario, which is the one you see in greenish in the plots, where you can see this abrupt change. So that is a scenario that kind of describes this disorderly transition. And I think more work should be done in better teasing out the disorderliness of this scenario, because the models are still not able to fully capture all the repercussions. And finally, I would like to point you to this resource. That's a pilot project on climate change scenario services, which is particularly dedicated to practitioners who are getting into the world of climate change scenarios, but are new to it and would like to look for a resource where they can receive tutorials and also targeted modules, interactive modules on specific insights, for example, like bridging the emissions gap, which I presented just before, and learn and do capacity building in this way. So with these two links, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elmar, for this rather scary presentation. Let's move to Carolyn Fischer and see if there are some suggestions on how to design policy that are up to the scale of the challenge. Carolyn Fischer holds a joint appointment as Professor of Environmental Economics at VU Amsterdam and as Canada 150 researcher holder in climate economics, innovation and policy at the University of Ottawa. Carolyn is also a senior fellow with Resource for the Future and with the European Institute of Environmental Economics and with CZ4 Research Network, and member of Environmental Canada Economics and Environmental Policy Research Network. Carolyn, you will have 20 minutes to present for your presentation, and then after your presentation, we're going to have a 15-minute session of Q&A. Carolyn, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Well, yep.
Excellent. Good morning from Washington, D.C. and buon pomeriggio a tutti in Italia. Mi dispiace non esserci con voi. Okay, so I'm going to talk about climate policy instrument design with a bit of a focus on industrial decarbonization. So this will be a little bit more from a micro perspective. In terms of climate policies, we have a great amount of agreement among economists that significant, comprehensive carbon pricing is the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. That's a quote from the Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends. It's been signed by 28 Nobel laureates, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, and many economists. So we see a great focus on the power of carbon pricing to incentivize decarbonization across, throughout the economy across a wide range of behaviors. In practice, though, we do see that carbon pricing is expanding worldwide. We see more and more jurisdictions picking up carbon pricing. It's somewhat roughly equally split between carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. However, the prices that we see and the coverage that we see are relatively low, certainly compared to the challenge. Nearly 80% of global emissions face a carbon price of 0 and arguably negative due to remaining fossil fuel subsidies. And we see that even most systems that price CO2 have rates, prices that are well below common notions of the social cost of carbon. So this is a graph from last year's World Bank Group State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. So we see the different carbon pricing systems. So here's the EU ETS, for example, is relatively large. It's covering a bit less than half of emissions in the jurisdiction. Now prices are actually getting up here to, I put sort of the Biden EPA notional social cost of carbon. I think most people would put a social cost of carbon sort of in this range. So we see most systems have relatively low prices, and also coverage is less than 100%. The other point that I want to make is that pricing systems that do cover industrial sectors are inevitably coupled with preferential treatment for industry. These are with direct or indirect subsidies for industrial sectors. As we just heard, industrial emissions is potentially an important bottleneck for getting to net zero. And I'll just point out that industry represents globally, a quarter of energy use. And they also contribute direct emissions through processes such as chemicals and cement. So this is a very important aspect of global carbon emissions. These sectors are also, large. They're politically powerful, and they're concerned, arguing that they may not be able to pass on carbon costs that are imposed upon them, being both emissions intensive, and so potentially bearing high costs from carbon pricing, and also trade exposed. So this is from a study of the EU sector, sort of flagging the industrial sectors at risk of carbon leakage. So we see sort of the classic ones: steel, aluminum, metals here, chemicals, etc. Now, it's worth pointing out and reminding that carbon pricing has 2 kinds of impacts on costs. So one is you have the carbon price itself creates an incentive to abate. So if we have, I'm an economist, so here's my marginal cost of abatement. So the firms will abate as long as the incremental costs are less than the carbon price. And so this leads to total abatement costs of these reductions. And basically any policy that is driving reductions is going to have abatement costs. The second component, though, that carbon is unique to carbon pricing is that it imposes a cost on the remaining emissions. So you have to pay for your remaining emissions. So these are embodied carbon costs. You can see here that unless the reductions are very deep, this rectangle of embodied carbon costs, it tends to be much larger than the triangle of abatement costs. So the question is, what to do about these embodied carbon costs. Many systems offer free allocation or rebating to reduce the net cost of embodied carbon. Now, there are a couple of different types of rebating. It's useful to distinguish between sort of unconditional rebating. So this is an allocation given regardless of the behavior of the firm, which then should not distort the incentives of the emissions price. And contrast this to conditional rebating, which is going to, in effect, subsidize the behavior that the rebate is conditioned upon. So the classic examples that we usually speak about is lump sum rebating. So this would be a truly unconditional rebate mechanism, generally used to compensate firms for their lost profits. It's also known as grandparenting. It used to be known as grandfathering. This is, for example, how the U.S. distributed emission allowances under the SO2 trading program. Now, important point is that to the extent that firms can pass on some of the embodied carbon costs, much less than 100% rebating is needed. There have been an early study by Larry Goulder et al. From Stanford found that maybe 15% of allowances would be enough to compensate industry for lost profits. There's a more recent study, Martin et al. Finding of EU firms finding 15 to maybe 25% is enough free allocation to compensate. In practice, though, very few allocation systems are truly unconditional. There are typically provisions for new entrants or significant changes in capacity, and they are updated over time. So that leads us to the next most common method of allocation or rebating, which I call output-based rebating. So the idea here is that the revenues from emissions pricing are returned to firms in proportion to their output. And so then in this case, we see that firms with high emissions intensity tend to make net payments, and firms with low emissions intensity actually get net refunds. Sweden used a form of output-based refunding with a tax to reduce NOx emissions in its power sector. California, New Zealand, these are places with emissions trading systems that explicitly use output-based allocation to firms. So they have a benchmark emissions intensity for identified sectors, and these firms' allocations of emission allowances are updated in proportion to their output multiplied by this benchmark. If we think about the EU ETS, it's arguably something in between lump sum and output-based rebating because we have the benchmarking exercises every few years determining allocations, and also there are provisions for large capacity changes. And then a third form of output-based rebating is explicitly emissions intensity targets. So you have a tradable performance standard. So the benchmark is actually the emissions target, and then you implement it with tradable credits. So emitters with higher emissions rates buy credits from sellers with lower emissions rates. This is an explicitly revenue neutral policy. For example, in terms of CO2 emissions, China's ETS in effect features tradable intensity standards. It's not a classic cap and trade system. And similarly in Canada, the federal backstop has an output-based pricing system, which is essentially a set of tradable performance standards. What all of these forms of output-based rebating have in common is that they're combining two price signals. So one is an emissions price that serves to signal abatement, incentivize abatement, And then the rebate, which in proportion to output acts as a production subsidy. So this rebate serves to offset the cost of embodied emissions on average for the sector and will mute the carbon price pass-through. So it's essentially a signal that we don't want abatement to be achieved by reducing output. We want to reduce emissions intensity. An important point then is that absent other market failures, this rebate is distorting. Normally we would want to see carbon costs pass through because other producers of competing products that may be lower carbon don't have a fair and even playing field because the carbon intensive products are not paying their full costs. A consequence of not using conservation or reduced output as a means of reducing emissions is that to meet the same emissions target, then the carbon price must rise. So you need to get more intensity reductions, and the way to signal that is through a higher carbon price. This means you're essentially shifting some of the burden of reductions elsewhere. Now, there are several legitimate reasons why you might want to consider this kind of conditional rebating. And so there are reasons why you may not always want to price embodied carbon fully. And I think the first one that comes to mind is carbon leakage or incomplete regulatory coverage. So if the firms that are facing carbon pricing are competing with close substitutes from firms who are not subject to the same level of regulation, same level of pricing, then muting that price pass-through helps avoid carbon leakage. Another concern is tax interactions. So these are sort of economy-wide concerns that emissions regulation can interact with pre-existing tax distortions in labor and capital markets. So the idea here is that if you pass through all the embodied carbon costs, you tend to raise prices. Higher prices erode the real wage, which further discourages labor supply, which is already distorted by the existence of labor taxes. So in this case, if you're not using the revenue from carbon pricing to lower other distorting taxes, then using it to keep prices from rising can actually lower regulatory costs. Another concern is price distortions, that you may already have imperfect competition or regulation that causes prices to already exceed the marginal social costs. You have inefficient pricing. There's a nice study by Bornstein and Bushnell looking at electricity pricing in the United States, for example, and in these blue parts of the country, electricity prices are already much higher than what they would calculate as the full social marginal cost, including the cost of emissions. You have distributional concerns. As you saw before, that rectangle is fairly big compared to the triangle, unless reductions are very, very deep. And so that means that rectangle are the costs that you're redistributing in the economy. So the proposal, so here, this is a study with Billy Pizer a couple of years ago, comparing a cap and dividend approach, sort of lump sum return of revenues to households, which tends to be progressive because poor people on average get back much more than they pay out. But you compare that to a tradable performance standard, which does not change energy prices very much. So we were looking at, there's a large amount actually of heterogeneity in energy use, even within deciles. So Although on average, most poorer households would be better off with cap and dividends, some of them are significantly worse off. And with the tradable performance standard, you're not changing prices so much, and you're not, so on average, sort of, lower effects, but much smaller, much less variation. Technical change, which I think Lint will talk about next, is another reason for thinking about these alternative rebate mechanisms. We've seen a lot of studies that the level of carbon prices that we would need to induce technical change, especially if there are there's path dependence, especially if there are spillovers from technical change that the markets aren't pricing. It's really hard to get carbon prices high enough to induce the amount of technical change that would be efficient. Using mechanisms that can ensure market share and ensure investment value can facilitate investments, these kind of lumpy investments that we need to decarbonize. Macroeconomic uncertainty is an issue. There we have a recent review paper for NBR, sort of looking at the literature on business cycles and carbon pricing, and actually optimal carbon pricing would sort of follow a business cycle, and there's some evidence that intensity standards sort of offer an in-between that allow for some emissions and price adjustment as economic situations evolve. So basically, there are multiple market failures that can add a rationale for rebating. And then I think the most, probably most prominent one is that when the regulation would otherwise be insufficiently stringent, you may want to deviate from what we would normally think of as the cost-effective policy. So, a broad-based carbon price that is low may be efficient in the sense of equalizing marginal abatement costs and opportunities across sources, but it's not going to be efficient in the sense of reflecting the true social costs. So if rebating can help greater acceptance of better aligned prices, it can improve efficiency. And we certainly see this. This is a study, Gallup poll, a couple of years ago in the US, but polls are very similar in the rest of the world. There's a lot more support, political support, for subsidies, for strategies that avoid imposing new taxes or prices. Standards, regulatory standards, are also much more popular than carbon pricing. And finally, I'll end with, there's some new rebating mechanisms that are emerging that are of interest. Rebates that may be, so you take the revenues from the carbon price and rebate it to incentivize greater investments in abatement. So Norway has a NOx fund for marine vehicle emissions that does this. And we've seen programs in the UK and in British Columbia that condition rebates on intensity reductions. And what's interesting about these intensity-based rebating schemes is that they combine a price on emissions with a subsidy to intensity reduction. So that's essentially increasing the opportunity cost of emissions. And so the same reductions can be achieved with a lower, a visible emissions price. If these intensity-based rebates are also proportional to output, then intensity-based rebating also supports production in a similar way to OBR. But a little caution, if the intensity-based rebate is a share of the firm's own emissions payments, which is what we've seen in the UK climate change agreements and the BC case, then part of the scheme is to subsidize emissions as well, and you don't, and you lose some efficiency there in terms of equalizing the incentives across firms. So I'll end with this summary. Addressing concerns about product price impacts can make room for stronger carbon pricing. We see that intensity-based rebating can amplify incentives for reductions without raising the carbon price, if that's a political constraint. Conditional rebating mechanisms, we have to remember can be distorting, although they can be helpful in a transition, dealing with competitiveness, distributional issues, etc. I think having benchmarks too can focus attention on the technological opportunities and the challenges that are needed for complementary R&D policies. And we have to remember that it's really important that the benchmarks be well designed to avoid introducing yet other distortions. And also remember that rebating is just one of several potential uses of carbon revenues, which could otherwise be available to boost the recovery, to shore up fiscal balance sheets, etc. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Then I open the floor here in presence, and also if our colleagues that are connected through WebEx, they do want to put some questions in the chat. I have a nice breaker question. One for Elmar. Elmar, you presented us a chart where you are showing that with BECCS technology, bioenergy with CCS, we need to capture as much as 20 gigatons. My question is really technical in a sense. We really have the capacity, according to your experience, to deploy such an intense absorption of greenhouse gas. And the last one is on Carolyn, because I think, Carolyn, you are treating a very interesting topics, because when we are thinking about carbon pricing, we are usually focusing on social unrest, on social issues, while you are more focusing on, if you want, industry acceptability. And I really would like if you could elaborate a bit on the relation between the two, no? Industry acceptability and social acceptability, also because in the concept of just transition, we have both. We have the impact of carbon pricing on vulnerable households, but we have also impact of carbon pricing on the transition on jobs and sectors that are more affected. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe I start on the question on carbon dioxide removal. So this particular scenario is certainly unrealistic. Having 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal is something that models can do, but that is very unlikely to happen in the real world. In scenarios that really try to take sustainability concerns, other risks into account, the amount of carbon dioxide removal is limited to a few gigatons after 2050 per year. And also, very importantly, carbon dioxide removal is much more than just bioenergy with CCS. The models have overemphasized this technology. It was hotly debated also in the fifth assessment report, but now there's recognition that we have a number of options in the land use sector, starting from things like peatland restoration to enhancing soil carbon, agroforestry, and these kind of measures. There's potential there. There are ideas to chemically remove CO2 from the air with direct air capture. Some startups have been in the news lately here also, and also use the CO2 that is removed not only for sequestering and storing, but they could also be recombined with green hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels. And so you can already see how the idea of a carbon economy comes up here, which is much broader than just bioenergy with CCS and sequestering. So limited amount of CDR and also multiple options here and not relying on only one option.
Thanks. Carolyn?
Yes, so I like your question about sort of the different types of political acceptability for carbon pricing. As economists, we tend to, really push for economic incentives as being efficient, and they're efficient because, you could, in theory, redistribute the benefits and make everyone better off. But that's only in theory. In practice, it's really difficult to design systems to do that. And so we see, so let's draw a distinction, but as you said, with the household acceptability, so households are affected by increases in energy prices and gasoline or electricity prices. There are certainly mechanisms in place. So, for example, in British Columbia, part of the revenues were given back to households. The Canadian federal backstop is similar, and most people most households are better off make money out of that system than not. But I think there are important problems in communicating that, because many people. So I have some colleagues at the University of British Columbia that found when people were informed of how much they were actually paying and getting back, they actually believed less that they were really being compensated. So there are important perceptions about that, and I think also important heterogeneity. So like the Gilets jaunes in France, you have fuel price hikes, even to pay for greener cars, but the price hikes hit people more in certain areas of the car-dependent areas of the country than they might in the cities, and so you may have it's very difficult to actually redirect the revenues to compensate folks in a way that doesn't interfere with the incentives to households. So that is a challenge, but again, we need to do a better job of communicating that by not using these sort of incentive-based policies, getting the prices right by implicitly subsidizing fossil fuels, then as a society we need to spend a lot more to subsidize technologies and to decarbonize the economy, which is going to weigh more heavily on public coffers and on citizens in other ways. So that message is a lot more complicated to get through, but it's an important one. I think contrasting with industry, they're going to be very knowledgeable about the effects of carbon pricing, and are much more concerned about competitiveness, because if they're exporting and competing on global markets, they rightly are less willing to undertake costs if their competitors are not facing similar costs. And so this is why we see a transition to border carbon adjustment in the EU as part of the EU Green Deal. But even within that, though, there's a great reluctance in industry to give up on free allocations. They want both. But the industry, in most places, there's a greater acceptance of carbon pricing because they would prefer more cost-effective methods of regulation, but they want it in ways that don't harm them vis-a-vis international competitors, which gets us back to the ultimate problem of climate change, is that this is a global, emissions reductions are a global public good, and there are great incentives to free ride, and we do not see enough action around the world.
Thanks, Carolyn. I agree that the message should be clear, that the transition is going to be costly. We have a question from you from the web chat, from the Zentis. The question is, in consideration of uncertainty of the climate change risk multidimensional effects, could you elaborate if you think it's a good idea to set a tax for the negative externalities in both companies and consumers, maybe replacing in part income tax, in order to allocate resources in a neutral way? This neutrality could provide price incentives without imposed restrictions in the technology, production, and social adaptation? Question mark. It's quite a question. So that's over to you, Carolyn.
Yeah, that's often a strong recommendation of how, like, good practices for implementing carbon pricing. So using part of the revenues to reduce other more distorting taxes in the economy. So the tagline is tax bads, not good. So tax carbon and reduce taxes on income, on productive inputs to the economy. So that that will certainly reduce the the tax interactions that I mentioned, and so having part of the revenues devoted to that, and then other parts devoted to addressing the distributional and justice issues, and then also the technology investments, technology R&D investments that need to be supported.
We have another question for you, Carolyn, and that's more specific and it's rather interesting, but it's again difficult to answer. From Eller Thorsten, can a well-designed rebating system alleviate the need for carbon border adjustment? Part of the reason for carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU is to replace current exemptions for given sector. Would there be a design for rebates that could at least alleviate the need for carbon border adjustment while still preserving external competitiveness?
Thanks for that question. And I think that has been the approach of the EU for a long time. And I think as long when carbon prices and the reductions targets are relatively modest, rebating is a reasonable substitute for border carbon adjustment. In fact, and I think that is why most countries, most jurisdictions that have carbon pricing on industry have been using rebating. Also because it avoids some of the potential trade frictions that setting up border carbon adjustments do. But we do see now, I think a last slide that I had was talking about sort of the limits and limitations to rebating, that as you get more ambitious, then the distortions from the rebating, for example, in the EU, if we're trying to get to net zero, then there aren't any allowances to allocate freely anymore. So as the standards get very stringent, it's hard to use rebating. You would have to go into fairly flagrant subsidies, which also have trade legality issues. So I think we see the transition towards border carbon adjustments as ambitions get stronger, and as a relatively more efficient policy in terms of if the goal is really to have more complete pricing of embodied carbon and sending the right price signals through the economy.
Thanks, Carolyn. We have a question now for Elmar from Enrico.
Elmar, thank you for your presentation. You show us a very comprehensive and nice list of policy intervention, and I would like you to elaborate about, given your expertise, if you have any insight on which policy mix of those interventions could be more preferable, considering that any policy initiative has trade-offs in terms of climate change goals and GDP and other macroeconomic effects. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, and also a very difficult one. So first, I think policy coordination is very important. We often have the situation that there are individual sector policies put in place by different ministries, and those don't really go well together. And then they're mixed with cross-sectoral policies like carbon pricing or so, and often coordination is lacking. So policy coordination is critical. In terms of how to embed or combine regulatory policies with carbon pricing, I think a good starting point is to look what additional externalities we have in the markets. Definitely, when we think of the transport sector or the building sector, it's very clear. There are spillover externalities, there are network externalities, there's asymmetric information involved. So looking for targeted policies to address these additional externalities that carbon pricing cannot address would be useful. So that is, I would say, on the one hand, policies to support innovation. Carolyn pointed this out, that carbon pricing is not doing well in inducing innovation. So that there will be targeted support for public-private partnerships and in producing new technologies, new ideas. Then I think pull policies that bring things to the market, like electric mobility mandates or subsidies, renewable energy. We have seen the effect of this. So I think these are useful combinations. I would also like to point out that there is a connection to the land sector here, which is an important one. First, I mentioned that it's not only about reducing CO2, but also about reducing methane, and a lot of methane is coming from the agricultural sector, particularly from livestock. The second element is that the land sector can also store CO2 in soils and plants. So here, I think a lot of incentive schemes would be useful. And when we think of a market for emissions reductions and also a market for carbon dioxide removal, in the models, it's all mixed together into one market. And I think for getting these started, it's wise to separate the two and really have a separate market on carbon dioxide removal and develop this carefully, including regulation. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Elmar. So we close this first part of the session. We're really grateful for your presentations and contribution and for the discussion. And I just quickly move. We are a bit late, sorry, for the next presenter to the next part of the presentation. We were going to have Lint Barrage presenting a paper on technology growth and climate policies, and Monika Piazzesi later on climate change and monetary policy. Let's start with Lint. Lint is Assistant Professor of Economics at the UC Santa Barbara and Faculty Research Fellows of the NBAR. Lint, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. All right. So in my remarks today, I would like to make the following key points. First, that technological progress is essential to addressing climate change in a growing global economy. Second, that at present, incentives for this innovation are grossly insufficient. In fact, we've seen during the past decade declines in many measures of green innovation in many countries. Ensuring appropriate incentives for innovation and mitigation requires not only a price on carbon emissions, but also direct fiscal support for innovation. And many models have found that providing such appropriately structured incentives can yield enormous economic benefits. I'd then like to close with a case study on the importance of considering implications for innovation incentives in both changes in energy markets and climate policy through the lens of the shale gas revolution in the United States. So I think it goes almost without saying that energy is essential for economic development. We know that there's a strong positive association between energy demand per capita and GDP per capita, shown here on the right. Now, globally, energy access remains a major challenge. By some estimates, about 1 in 10 people still lacks access to electricity. And importantly, almost half the world's population lacks access to reliable sources of energy. And we know that reliability is important for productivity and economic growth. We see this obviously in the short run right now with countries that have suffered industrial output losses due to electricity outages. But we also see it in the long run, even in countries that are used to having shortages, they'll still contribute to lower levels of productivity and serve as an impediment to growth. Another important thing to remember about the energy challenge we face in the next 30 years is that global energy demand is predicted to increase substantially by about 80% by mid-century, according to some estimates. And 100% of this demand increase is generally projected to come from emerging economies. Now, against the backdrop of this challenge, an unfortunate reality is that with current technologies, fossil fuels are generally still the cheapest source of reliable power available. Of course, that's not the case everywhere in every setting, but I think it's important to note that some of the numbers we sometimes hear about solar and wind costs having come down, they often disregard the fact that those sources of energy are intermittent. And when we calculate the levelized cost of providing, say, electricity, excuse me, from fossil or renewable intermittent sources, adding the cost of backing up intermittent sources from batteries or natural gas, for example, we often see, as shown here in this graph for the United States, that existing coal or gas power plants are still cheaper than solar backed up with wind, with gas, or wind backed up with batteries or gas. Now, the need for technological progress is also apparent when we dig under the surface of some of the scenarios of emissions reductions that are often mentioned as a policy aspiration. So, for example, the path to net zero by 2050, we already saw in Elmar's presentation the immense changes that are required for these scenarios. But we can also see specific predictions of some of the large-scale deployment of relatively novel technologies that will be required. So here are some estimates by BP for, in blue, the transition to net zero by 2050. And we see, for example, that the share of renewables is predicted to have to increase from about 5% of primary energy to 60% over the course of only 30 years. We also see that what may be required is rapid electrification of transportation and other sectors, so that the share of electricity in final consumption will increase from about 25 to almost 60%. Novel technologies such as hydrogen and carbon capture and storage will also have to play a significant role and be widely deployed in some of these scenarios. Now, to put this in historical context, we've historically seen that energy transitions progress on a slower pace. So, for example, for coal displacing biomass, it took 50 years from coal to go from 5% of global energy supply to 40%. It took 50 years for oil to go from 5% to only 30%. And again, one of the potential benchmarks going ahead may be to take renewables from 5 to 60% in only 30 years, highlighting the big challenge that we face and the progress in technologies that will be needed in order to facilitate this transition. Now, unfortunately, these policy aspirations stack up quite poorly compared to the current market reality. So one thing that we've seen in the data is that during the past decade, green innovation has actually been declining in many areas and measures. So on this graph, we have 4 measures of green electricity innovation for the US Patent Office, patent filings at the US Patent Office, including renewable over total patents, renewable over fossil fuel electric patents, green, that's renewable plus nuclear plus biofuel over total patents, and green over fossil fuel electric patents. And all of these measures show a similar trajectory, that there had been a steady increase in green innovation, but around 2009, 2010, a decline started that continued throughout the subsequent decade. I should say on this graph, these are ratios, but we also find that the level of green electricity patenting has declined over this time period. It's not just the United States, we see similar patterns in other countries. So here in this graph, we have the ratio of renewable over fossil fuel electric patents, and we see declines during the past decade in Japan, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and many other important innovation markets. Now, there's many potential contributing factors driving this change in the market, but one likely key contributor is the fact that fossil fuels have been cheaper for much of the past decade. So we see on this graph the ratio of green over fossil fuel electric patents filed at the US Patent Office against a 2-year lag measure of natural gas price index in the United States. And what's been true, not just during the past 10 years, but also before, is that cheaper natural gas is generally associated with subsequent reductions in green innovation and vice versa. We see this not only from eyeballing the graph, but many studies have shown, looking both at micro evidence of patenting at firms and at macro evidence looked through the lens of just structural macro models, that cheaper fossil fuels are generally associated with reductions in green electricity innovation, reductions in energy efficiency innovation, reductions in clean automotive technology patenting, and a host of relevant innovation measures. We see here also the graph on the right is from a recent paper by Hustler et al. Looking at the or demonstrating the co-movement between fossil fuel price indices in red and changes in the rate of progress in energy efficiency technologies, which again we see cheaper fossil fuels generally mean reductions in the acceleration of efficiency in energy uses in GDP. Now, of course, to be more precise, the concern is not that fossil fuels are cheap per se, but that they fail to reflect the social cost of carbon emissions. Carolyn was already discussing this in her presentation. But some estimates by the IMF from a couple of years ago suggest that the average global price on carbon right now is as low as $2 per ton CO2. Contrast that with standard estimates of the social cost of carbon emissions around 40, 50 to 100 plus by some estimates dollars. This is also in line with what would be needed as a starting point for reaching the Paris Agreement temperature goals. So the first reason that currently market incentives for green innovation are insufficient is because carbon prices are simply too low. A second likely culprit is low levels of direct fiscal support for innovation activities. It's important to note that green innovation really suffers from a double externality because on the one hand, the benefits of emissions reductions are not priced by the market. But it's also generally true that the social benefits from innovation exceed their private returns. And some recent models of directed technical change that account carefully for the way that innovation process builds on itself have further found that this innovation externality is larger for green technologies than than fossil fuel energy technologies, as we want the future size of the green energy market to be larger than it is today. All of which is to say that ensuring appropriate incentives require not only a price on carbon, but also direct subsidization of green R&D activities. Now, of course, such subsidies exist, and it's slightly more challenging to judge them from an efficiency perspective, but here's a couple of figures we can mull over, so to speak. So from 2009 through 2018, the US Department of Energy's average annual funding for all types of energy R&D, including fossil, was about $4.8 billion. To put this in perspective, over the same time period, on average, US households spent about $7.3 billion on Halloween candy and costumes every year. Now, of course, this says nothing about efficiency. And constructing an estimate of the efficient green subsidy requires a quantitative model of the innovation process, which there's a lot of question marks in how to do that. But some studies have put forth such models, and they generally find that the optimal green R&D subsidy should be right now on the order of about 90 to 100%. What we do see in the data tends to be lower than this. So the most recent year of high quality US National Science Foundation data suggests that renewable energy effective average R&D subsidy was only about 14%. There's some other estimates that put the overall clean energy subsidy slightly higher, but generally below, again, what would be required to internalize the externality, which is a much higher subsidy. Now, it's important to know, I think we all intuitively know this, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves of the numbers, that appropriately structured fiscal support or taxation of carbon and energy could yield large economic benefits. That's true not only globally, but also domestically, certainly for large economies such as the United States. So here's just some estimates from my own work. There's many others in the literature, suggesting that optimized carbon and energy taxation could yield welfare gains at the global level of $24 to $40 trillion, and even strictly domestic benefits in the United States from 170 to $1.8 trillion. Now, this is a wide range, and some of that range comes from differences in assumptions over what the fiscal scenarios will be that governments face going forward. Because both the revenue benefits of carbon pricing and also the fiscal benefits of mitigating climate change, which will reduce the fiscal costs of climate change itself, such as natural disaster aid, healthcare costs, some of which Tatiana discussed yesterday, depend on the fiscal scenario. But certainly in a fiscally constrained economy, we would expect the larger end of the benefits of carbon pricing. Also, again, studies have found that integrating carbon taxation with appropriate subsidies for R&D activities substantially increases the welfare gains from climate policy, on the order of 1.5–2% of a balanced growth equivalent consumption increase, according to some recent estimates. So I want to close with a mini case study, again highlighting the importance of thinking about innovation incentives in energy markets and climate policy design by discussing the shale gas revolution in the United States. So over the past decade, there's been a dramatic increase in the United States in natural gas production from shale deposits, and that's thanks through breakthrough advancements in the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracking technologies. And as a result of the strong increase in supply, we've also seen an increase in the consumption of natural gas in the United States, including its role in electricity generation. So on this graph, we have the respective shares in US electricity generation of coal in red and of natural gas in green. And we see that during the past decade, natural gas has surpassed coal as the dominant fuel in US electricity generation. Now, from a climate perspective, this is significant in part because natural gas emits around 40% less carbon dioxide per BTU of energy than does coal. So along with this rise in natural gas, we've seen a dramatic decline in the CO2 emissions intensity of US electricity generation, depicted here in red. We've also seen a decline in CO2 emissions levels from US electricity generation, depicted in green. Studies have documented this again also more carefully with careful empirical studies at the electricity generator level. And I should say the literature has also documented that the shale boom has led to increases in incomes and wages in the United States. Now, that all being said, these short-run benefits, we have to remember what we saw a few slides ago about the strong association between natural gas prices and green innovation. That cheaper natural gas we would generally expect to lead to a reduction in green innovation, as we have seen in the data. And so together with my co-authors, we construct a quantitative model of the US economy, including energy innovation, that replicates the implied increase in the share of scientific activity focusing on fossil fuel electricity technologies. So the graph on the right, we have time on the x-axis, and the green line is the predicted share of researchers working in fossil fuel technologies before the boom, and the blue line is the share of researchers working in fossil fuel technologies after the shale boom, absent further policy intervention. And the model predicts that the shale boom would delay the transition to a green economy by shifting innovation away from green toward fossil fuels. So as a result, our model suggests that the shale boom has mixed effects on the climate. On the one hand, as we already saw, so on this graph is the percent change in each variable as a result of the boom over time. For emissions depicted on blue, we predict, yes, a decline in emissions in the short run, but absent further policy intervention, an increase in emissions in the long run. And again, this is because the shale boom shifted innovation away from green toward fossil, and by improving fossil fuel generation technologies, made them more attractive than they would have been. By delaying innovation in green, made them more backwards than they would have been at this point in time, thus creating an increase in emissions over time. The initial increase in GDP due to the shale boom is also, in the long run, offset by decreases in GDP arising from the fact that increased emissions lead to increased climate damages, which will eventually decrease GDP, again, holding all else constant. So the optimal policy response to this, once again, would consist of a carbon price that is rising over time and a high level of green innovation subsidies, shown here in the panel on the left. And I should say these innovation subsidies are slightly smaller in magnitude, 30 to 40%, than the previous figure I mentioned. This is because in this model we have an America First planner, so to speak, who doesn't consider the rest of the world. Importantly, we also find that the optimal policy response to the shale boom is to increase subsidization of green innovation to counteract the side effect in technology markets. With these policy responses in hand, the shale boom could be strictly beneficial by decreasing the cost of climate mitigation and without having this detrimental effect on green technologies. So to summarize, again, the main points I wish to highlight are first, again, the importance of innovation in addressing climate change and allowing for growth in emerging markets. Second, the fact that at current market situation, incentives for this critically needed innovation remain grossly insufficient due to both the lack of a carbon price and limited fiscal support, and that providing these incentives could yield enormous economic benefits. Finally, we see through the example of the US shale boom that while in the short run emissions may have declined and GDP may have gone up, without appropriate policy intervention in the long run, there is a risk of emissions increasing and GDP decreasing, again, highlighting the importance of thinking about innovation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lint. Very interesting presentation. We go to the next speaker. She is Monika Piazzesi. Monika is John Kenney Professor of Economics at Stanford University and BR Associate as EPR Senior Fellow and CPR Research Fellow. She's going to talk about climate change and monetary policy. We are central banks, so more than interested to hear her. Monika, are you online?
Yes, thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Over to you.
You see my slides well?
Not yet, but maybe it's just... Okay, yeah, so we see it. Everything's fine.
I'm going to talk about climate change and monetary policy, and I'm going to draw on joint work with Melina Papuzzi, who's at the ECB, and my colleague Martin Schneider. So interest rates have been low for a while. So we're in a low interest rate environment, and in this environment, the main tool for monetary policy has been unconventional monetary policy. Central banks have been buying assets. Initially, they bought government bonds. Then they started buying mortgage-backed securities, other asset-backed securities. And most recently, central banks have started buying corporate bonds. The goal, of course, is to lower firms' cost of capital, stimulate investment. But the question remains, which corporate bonds should central banks buy? And so the conventional view on this is that monetary policy should aim for market neutrality. The reason is that central banks don't have a mandate to favor particular firms. So they don't have a mandate really to do green investment. And so they want to stay market neutral. And so what they do in practice is purchase bonds proportional to the amount of bonds outstanding. So this is a simple formula that central banks use in order to stay market neutral. And so in this work, what we're trying to do is understand what are market neutral asset purchases. So if I had to advise the central bank on how to be neutral, what would I recommend? And also, what is the current ECB portfolio look like? Is that neutral? And then we can also ask the question that Carolyn and Lint asked, essentially, what's optimal? What is an optimal policy, especially in a world where you have both climate externalities and financial frictions? And so the empirical part that I'm going to show you is we're measuring ECB holdings of individual bonds that are in the ECB portfolio. We measure outstanding bonds of firms in the euro area, and we measure emissions by sector. And we benchmark these holdings to the market portfolio of firm values. So think about a sector and think about all the firms within the sector. And there we want to measure what is the market value of equity of the firms in the sector plus their debt. That would correspond to a measure of sectoral capital shares. So we want to know, how does the ECB portfolio compare to the market portfolio? And what it turns out is that the ECB portfolio, the current ECB corporate bond portfolio, looks like sector shares of emissions. It does not look like the market portfolio. And so what happens is that the ECB overweighs sturdy industries relative to the market portfolio. You may ask, why is that? Why does the ECB assemble a portfolio that looks like the sector shares of emissions? The reason is that the way the ECB implements its notion of market neutrality is it buys proportional to the amount of bonds outstanding, and it just happens to be the case that dirty sectors issue relatively more bonds. They have more tangible assets, and so they can issue more bonds, and so that's what they do, and then the ECB buys these bonds. We can still ask the question, are dirty asset purchases market neutral? Are they somehow optimal, or should they be greener? And so for that, you need a framework. And so we've been working hard on coming up with a framework to think about market neutrality and optimality of asset purchases by central banks. And so this is a growth model with heterogeneous firms that features climate externalities and financial frictions, where firms are heterogeneous because they differ by how risky they are and their emission intensity. And so then asset purchases in this framework work through liquidity and risk premia. There's a liquidity effect because by announcing that the ECB will buy bonds of a firm, it will lower liquidity premia on firms' bonds. And that benefits firms that are highly bond levered more. There's also a risk effect, which is that a purchase program creates more safe central bank debt, or safe government debt, and thereby it lowers risk exposures of private intermediaries. That lowers risk premia on many, many assets, not just the assets that the ECB is buying directly, but it's benefiting many assets. In particular, it benefits risky firms more. And so this is a general equilibrium effect that is really important and is the key transmission mechanism of unconventional monetary policy. And so within this setup, we can ask, what is a market neutral policy? And so the natural way to define market neutrality will be to say firms should have the same relative cost of capital before and after the policy. So the central bank does not benefit one firm in terms of its cost of capital relative to other firms. So in other words, the policy only has macro effects. It does not distort the market portfolio. And what we show in the setup is that a market neutral policy essentially does not exist. It only exists under very special assumptions on the model that are not supported by the data. In particular, the current ECB portfolio is definitely not true neutral. It favors dirty firms. These firms are both bond levered and risky. What's optimal? And so this goes back to what Lint and Carolyn already mentioned. What would the planner do in the model? The planner would design a carbon tax and also an asset purchase program, which is addressing financial frictions. So the asset purchase program would not look at climate externalities. Instead, it would focus financial frictions. And so it would not be neutral because it would favor risky firms where the financial frictions show up the most. And so it would, these purchases would not look neutral. They would favor risky firms, but it would need a carbon tax in place. What if there is no carbon tax, or a carbon tax, as Lint mentioned, that is not sufficient? Then it's beneficial to favor green firms. So let me talk about the literature. There is a big literature that looks at price impacts of unconventional monetary policy. Most recently, these papers have looked at the price impact of corporate bond purchases. There's a number of papers that think about the economic mechanisms of through which unconventional monetary policy works. So here we want to understand what happens in the cross section for different firms. And so basically, as soon as you start thinking about the cross section, it's related to thinking about misallocation of capital in different firms. And so there's recent work that thinks about how does monetary policy affect the misallocation of capital in the economy. Most of this work focuses on conventional monetary policy. And so here, when you think about green asset purchases, this is thinking about misallocation from the point of view of unconventional monetary policy. Naturally, it's also related to integrated assessment models that think about the negative impact of the quality of the environment on future TFP. So as the environment worsens, how will that negatively affect TFP? And then you have an exploding literature recently that thinks about climate finance, lots of work documenting that firms that pollute have to pay a higher cost of capital, both in bond markets as well as in the stock market. And there's recent work, including at the Bank of Italy, on green monetary policy and thinking about what is the role of monetary policy in this. So let me first show you what the ECB currently does. So this is using data on individual securities holdings of the ECB, so individual bonds that we merged to the ECB centralized security database on the amount of bonds outstanding. And so what's important in this work is to deal with special purpose entities. So if you look at the raw data of bonds that the ECB holds, you find that 56% of ECB holdings are firms in the finance sector that issue these bonds. But we know that those bonds are ineligible because the ECB cannot buy bonds of firms in the finance sector. And so what is going on? What the ECB does, it buys bonds from companies like Royal Dutch Shell, which is an oil manufacturer, but the bonds are actually issued by a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, which is Shell International Finance BV, which is a company that officially belongs in the finance sector. And so what we do is we research special purpose entities. You have to do this by hand. You have to research every individual bond and then attribute the bond to the right sector. That reduces bonds in the ECB portfolio issued from the finance sector to 11%. It's hard to get beyond that because there are finance companies that issue bonds for very small companies, and then it's hard to attribute these bonds to the right sectors because these are small companies. So what I'm going to show you is results for the non-financial sectors, but again, we're only missing 11% of the ECB portfolio. And then I'm going to benchmark the ECB portfolio to 3 measures of the market portfolio by sector. The first measure is capital income from Eurostat. The second measure is book assets of companies from Orbis. The third measure is for public companies within the sector. I can measure market value because I have the market value of equity from Orbis. And luckily, the results using the 3 alternative measures look the same. You'll find them on the paper posted on my website. Here today, I'm just going to show you capital income shares. So here's how they look like. On the horizontal axis, you have what is the share of total capital income that each sector has. And on the vertical axis, you see the various sectors: agriculture, automobiles. There's a large manufacturing sector that we split up into subsectors that have very high emissions. This is oil and coke, chemicals, basic metals, and non-metallic minerals. And then there's other manufacturing that you see further down the vertical line. Utilities, transportations, and services. And so what you see is that Europe is an advanced economy, and in all advanced economies, the service sector is the largest sector of the economy. Let's compare that to the ECB portfolio. So this is how the ECB divides its bond portfolio into the various sectors. And so what you see is that the ECB holds a fair amount of bonds issued by the automobile industry, dirty manufacturing, utilities, and transportation, and other manufacturing. And it doesn't hold many bonds issued by the service sector. Let me compare that with emissions of the various sectors. So these are Scope 1 emissions, direct emissions of the various sectors. And so here, now your eye starts comparing the red, which is the market share, with the blue, which is the ECB portfolio, with the gray, which is emissions of the sector. And so what you see is that what the ECB is doing, it's overweighing dirty sectors, dirty manufacturing, utilities, transportation, other manufacturing, and it is underweighing services. Services is a relatively clean sector, and the ECB is not buying many bonds issued by the service sector. And so then you can think about this portfolio and ask, what is the, how can we think about this? Are these asset purchases by the ECB, are they somehow, can they be neutral or can they be optimal? Is this portfolio a good portfolio for the ECB to buy? And so for that, I need the framework. And so the framework is going to be a growth model with a representative household that has preferences over some final consumption goods, so standard preferences. The household inelastically supplies 1 unit of labor. There is a final good that is made from intermediate goods. So there are different sectors in the economy, and there are very many different varieties of goods that are produced within the sector. And so the way we're setting this up is in the standard way of setting up a growth model with different sectors where final output is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of output in the various sectors, and the various sectoral outputs are a CES aggregate of the individual productions of individual firms within the sector. Then we add firm-specific climate externalities in production. And so the way this is done in integrated assessment models is that you have a measure of the quality of the environment. We call this ADA. And I'm going to call it, for short, I'm going to call it temperature. And so temperature increases with the emissions of the various farms. So you see epsilon here, I, is the emission intensity of firm I at time t. And so if firm I produces little yt at time t, then total emissions of that firm is just epsilon I times yi. And so you aggregate up all the emissions of the various farms, and that increases temperature. So you see these unit root dynamics of temperature. And then they're linear, but then they may affect TFP in production of firm I. So here you see that production uses a standard Cobb-Douglas production function where the capital shares and labor shares are common within the sector. So the firms don't have their individual capital share. They have a common capital share within the sector. And then the temperature negatively affects TFP. And that dependence can be highly nonlinear. There may be trigger points after which it's really catastrophic. So that dependence is nonlinear, while the dynamics of temperature itself are linear. So you have these externalities, negative externalities in production because they negatively affect the environment. But to think about QE, you need a different friction, which is a financial friction. So let's imagine that firm I sells claims to its capital as different securities. So these are different securities as there's equity, there are bonds that the firms issue, then there are bank loans, and the sum of all these different securities, I'm going to call them A bar, is what the firms issue. What firm I issues of security as at time t is just to finance total capital that they have. And these claims are held by households using, and you can think of basically private intermediaries or the central bank. There are two ways of holding these different assets for households. And both of these holdings come with holding costs. So there are some resource costs in terms of the final good. So it's costly for households to hold assets. And these costs, what do they capture? They can either capture risk-taking, so holding assets of a particular firm may be very risky, and so that is a cost that households have. Or this cost may be a friction, so it may capture costs of financial distress in the intermediary sector. And so both of these are costly and generate holding costs. And so the key to think about in terms of holding securities for households is how this cost function looks like. So for private intermediaries, the natural way to think about these costs is to think about them as being homogeneous of degree 1. So the more private assets these intermediaries are holding and the more central bank debt, DT, they hold, the more costs they have. And also these costs will be quasi-convex. What does this capture? What does this functional form assumption capture? Is that diversification lowers costs. That's what it captures. And so also these costs will depend on the capital structure of the firms. because if firms lever up, if they have high leverage, then they're very risky, and that increases the costs of holding these claims to capital. And also, it will depend on whether firms are eligible for central bank purchases. So there's a subset I wiggle of all the firms that is eligible for central bank purchases, and that will affect the holding costs for private intermediaries. And then there's an analogous function for the central bank. So I'm not saying it's free for the central bank to buy assets. The central bank has its own cost function. That's what the little wiggle indicates. But it may be different from what private intermediaries experience as costs. And so in such a world, what happens in equilibrium? How do the market portfolio shares of individual firms get determined? So how much capital there is in firm I relative to the total capital stock? How does that get determined? So it depends on the marginal holding cost of assets of this firm. So what happens in the model is the marginal product of capital of every individual firm will be equated to its cost of capital. That part is standard. And then you equate the cost of capital to the safe rate in the economy, and then times a term that has to do with the marginal holding costs of private intermediaries for these assets of firm I, of security S, which are it's a weighted average. So you see here, I'm summing over all these marginal holding costs, and it's a weighted average of these marginal holding costs times the share of capital of firm I that is financed with security S. So in a frictionless world, these marginal holding costs, you see, it's basically capturing the return premium of firm I over the risk-free rate. So in a frictionless world where you have no financial frictions, these marginal holding costs, they just capture a risk premium. And so it's just compensation for holding a claim to a company that is very risky. In this world, central bank purchases don't matter. And so you'll find many economists who think QE doesn't matter. And so whether central banks or not will do these corporate bond purchases, it does not affect the cost of capital of these companies. And so economists like that think that these premia are just risk premia, and the total holding costs, the private holding costs plus the central bank holding costs, are independent of how much the central bank is holding. And it's also independent of the eligible set of firms for the asset purchase, so that those don't affect holdings. However, with frictions, what you get, if you look at this equation, you get misallocation. Basically, firms that experience high marginal holding costs, if those are financial frictions, then you get inefficiently low capital share in firm I. And so now you have a role for the central bank. First of all, you can, as central bank, take firm I risk off of private intermediaries' balance sheets. So you make private intermediaries safer by taking off risky assets from their balance sheet. So they're holding what the firms issue, that was by A bar, minus that what the central bank is holding. And so if the central bank holds more, the private intermediaries hold less. So that's one way the central bank matters. The second is the central bank finances these asset purchases with safe government debt, in particular with reserves. So you buy corporate bonds with reserves. That makes the balance sheet of private intermediaries safer through this D channel. The third channel is that you can improve liquidity of firm I bonds by making them eligible. By just announcing that bonds issued by fiat are eligible for the purchase program, you make fiat bonds more liquid. And so now within this world, I can now think about what market neutrality is. And so the natural definition in such a framework is to think of a market neutral policy as one that does not affect relative cost of capital of firms. So you do not change relative cost of capital. So the market neutral policies don't affect the market portfolio. how much capital there is in firm I relative to total capital, you don't affect it. So you start from a laissez-faire equilibrium without the central bank purchase program. You do a comparative static to an equilibrium with a purchase program, and the market portfolio has to be unchanged. And so is there a central bank portfolio that will leave the market neutral? The answer is going to be no. It is essentially impossible for central banks to be market neutral. There are two key sources of non-neutrality. First of all, you lower liquidity costs of bonds with your asset purchases. That favors more bond-levered firms. And also the central bank provides safe debt and it lowers private risk exposure in general equilibrium, and that favors more risky firms. And so for these policies to be neutral, they would have to magically offset. And so you need divine coincidence for this to be neutral. Can you imagine a world in which ECB policies would be neutral? Yes, I can dream of one. I can think of a world in which all firms have the same bond leverage, or I can allow the ECB to buy stocks. And then secondly, I can think of a financial market in which private securities and central bank debt are held by different intermediaries. So you have segmented markets for these two instruments, private securities and central bank debt. In that case, my holding costs are separable because they are held by different institutions. So if you have 1 and 2 in the world, so same bond leverage and the segmented markets, then policies would be neutral. But this is a very special financial system, is not in line with what we see in the data, where ECB policies affect premia of assets exactly through the channel, the second channel, which is that these markets are not segmented. And we also observe that firms don't have the same bond leverage. Some firms don't issue bonds at all. And so to think about policy impact of the ECB, we now have to think about costs, fund holding costs that are consistent with asset pricing data. And so how do I think of these costs? So how do costs of capital get affected of firm I? So basically you affect the cost of capital for firm I because the policy affects the risk-free rate. So the risk-free rate changes, but that affects all firms equally. You also affect the liquidity premium of the bonds of firm I, but that change in the liquidity premium gets multiplied by the share of bonds that firm I has relative to its capital. Then there is an effect to the change in risk premium on equity and debt. So let me think about ballpark numbers based on the response to the 2016 ECB program. Can the ECB have an effect on cost of capitals of firms through its corporate bond purchase program? So basically, by saying policy has an impact on the cost of capital, that already, so any empirical work that will say it does have an impact, that will separate the risk premium part of these marginal holding costs from the financial frictions. So that's what identifies financial frictions. And so we know from empirical work that the liquidity effects are small, including by, so this is my co-author, Melina Papuzzi, has documented that the average effect on bonds that are eligible for the ECB purchase program is roughly 15 basis points controlling for risk. So this is not much. So it's 15 basis points. And then as you see from the top equation, you have to multiply that with the bond share, which is 10%. So 10% times 15 basis points is a very small number. So liquidity is not really important. What is important is risk effects. So that's the red channel. There's empirical work by Todorov that documents that bonds with a 1 percentage point higher premium fall by 50 basis points more. There's other work by Bolton and Kakpachik that documents that firms that have 1 standard deviation higher emissions have to pay a 4 percentage point higher risk premium on their stocks. Also, we know that roughly the average firm is 25% debt financed. So if you would translate the 4% premium on stocks of these high emission firms to the cost of capital, it's roughly 3 percentage points higher for these polluting firms.
Sorry, Monika, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. You should conclude. Sorry.
Yes, I will. Let me just announce the basic number, which is, so basically then I can think about how can I affect the cost of capital of firms with higher emissions. They will fall by 1.5 percentage point more. And if I take standard numbers for this model, a capital share of 1/3 and elasticity of 3 of goods within the sector, then I find that firms with 1 standard deviation higher emissions have 1.5 percentage points more output and emissions relative to firms with lower emissions. And so let me conclude here. Basically, I showed you that what the ECB is doing right now is the opposite of what it should be doing. It's assembling a portfolio that is dirty. It has a lot of firms that have high emissions. If it wanted to be market neutral, it would have to leave the relative cost of capital the same. Otherwise, it's distorting. But holding bonds in proportion to the amount of bonds outstanding, that's not the right recipe for neutrality. Right now, the ECB favors risky and bond-levered firms. What would be the optimal thing is, this goes back to what Carolyn and Lint said, have a carbon tax. Then you can do asset purchases that just address financial frictions. But without a carbon tax, having green asset purchases actually are beneficial. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Monika, for your presentation. So it's time to open the floor for the Q&A session. There are questions here. I think there was a question from Filippo for Lint Barrage.
Thank you very much. Lint was a very interesting presentation. Actually, the picture you show of oil prices and the share of green patents is impressive. I know it's just correlation, but nonetheless, it suggests that oil prices can be a relevant driver of green patenting. And my question is, as oil pricing is done in financial markets, I'm wondering whether the effect of financial investment can in turn pass on to the choice of green patenting. So what I have in mind is the financialization of commodity prices. According to that literature, in this financialization, so-called speculative investment, has affected, can be partly responsible for the boom and bust of oil prices in the 2000s. Could you please elaborate a bit on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an interesting question. So if I may make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly, is the question whether different drivers of oil price shocks essentially would be expected to have the same impact on innovation, whether it's a genuine demand shock, supply shock, or a speculation shock? Is that the question?
Yeah, the question is that, so the kind of speculative investment can have an effect on the choice of green patenting through financial markets. So if financial markets can be also determinant for the share of green patenting going on, given the picture, the striking association that you showed before.
And what an interesting question. So through the lens of the standard way we think about the endogeneity of technological change, we would think of inventors as thinking about their expectations of what is the size of the market for a given technology in the future, what is the price of, say, the inputs of generating electricity with a gas turbine. So it's the expectation of input prices that we would expect to have that effect. So, depending on whether price fluctuations are driven by demand shocks or supply shocks, we would quantitatively expect the effect to be different, but qualitatively it could still be in the same direction. With regards to financial speculation, I think the key question is, would inventors expect prices to remain high in the future or not for inputs, say, to, again, generating electricity from fossil fuel resources? So if the expectation in future prices is that input costs will still be higher, then I would venture to guess yes. But I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting question.
Okay, thanks, Lint. There is a request from the floor. Okay, two.
Hi, I have a question for Monika, please. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. The Bank of England published a paper a few months ago by its executive director, Andrew Hauser. The paper was called "It's Not Easy Being Green." I think they were trying to quote Kermit the Frog from The Muppet Show in that headline, if I got the joke correctly. Anyway, in that paper, Bank of England was actually raising most of the concerns or most of the points that you're discussing in your research as to why its corporate bond portfolio is kind of dirty as well, and that's basically it's not easy to greenify it, I suppose. But one additional point that he raised is that by the nature of the central bank's operating model, they're required to hold the highest quality assets. So when it comes to the corporate bond portfolio, again, it so happens is that not only the dirty firms have more bonds, but also they happen to be higher graded. So the central bank is almost forced to be biased towards the dirtier firms because they need to hold highest quality assets. With corporate bonds, they're already kind of stepping a little bit into the danger territory of moving away from pure government bonds, so they have to sort of hold themselves to that level of quality. And so if they were to step away from that, then it's not that it's impossible, but the question is, can we envision the situation where another institution can step in to absorb the credit risk? So, for example, the Treasury, hypothetically speaking. And of course, in Europe specifically, since you're talking about the ECB mostly, we know that smaller firms, and therefore, I guess less dirty firms, actually don't even finance themselves in the bond market. They tend to finance themselves in the banking sector. And again, with the experience of the ECB, we know that it's actually not easy to simply give liquidity to the banking sector in order to incentivize it to lend further down to the smaller corporate sector. We've seen this with LTROs and TLTROs over the past decade or so. So my question to you is that shouldn't we start thinking about the possibility of bringing in a third institution into the picture, such as the Treasury or the Development Bank, in order to start absorbing the credit risk of smaller issues in order to make it easier for the central bank to be financing, to greenify essentially its operating model. And also the second question is, let's remind ourselves that the corporate bond purchases, there's a reason why we call that an unconventional monetary policy tool. It's something that central banks have to do because they currently don't have an instrument that can reach the real economy directly. Right, central banks only have cash and reserves. Cash is too small, it's for retail use, and reserves are for the financial system. So in order to reach the real economy, whether it's to lower the financing costs or to stimulate production, etc., there's almost this round, almost like a day tour, if you will, of having to go through the corporate bond market. Obviously, right now, almost every central bank is looking at the possibility of introducing the central bank digital currency, which will be a way for the central bank to have an instrument that reaches the real economy directly, not through the banking system, but directly.
I have to ask
yes,
question.
Sorry, so the question is, with the presence of a credit-absorbing institution, such as the Treasury, and with the introduction of a new monetary tool, such as the central bank digital currency, can't we just let the corporate bond portfolio sort of grandfather, or as I heard earlier, grandparent itself, and focus on the new ways of financing the economy for the central bank?
Okay.
Sorry for the lengthy question.
I think you're raising an important issue, and this is also what when you're looking at the current portfolio of the ECB, you see that this is going in the wrong direction. Could you do better? Absolutely. There are bonds that the ECB could be buying that are greener. So it's not, the ECB is not somehow magically forced to buy this portfolio. So it's not impossible. But there is this tension that corporate bonds, they are safe, they're highly rated when within the firm you have a lot of tangible assets. So you can have this is the paradox. You can have a firm that is highly risky, it's super exposed to transition risk, so has a high stock return, but has a very safe corporate bond rating because it has a lot of tangible assets. And that's the tension that central banks face. But you don't need to limit yourself to corporate bonds. I mean, let's remind ourselves what the Swiss National Bank does. It buys equity. So it does exactly assume more risk than the ECB, and it's doing fine. So I would challenge the ECB to say, why limit yourself to corporate bonds if other central banks have already started buying equity? And that's important because, as Lint was saying, you want to we need innovation to get us to a carbon neutral future. That innovation has to be financed. These people are going to be entrepreneurs that have new ideas. They will be young people without any tangible capital. They will not be able to issue bonds. So you need to buy their equity. And so we need to say central banks have to think about how to get us there. And they have responsibility to share in getting us there. And that means we need to think about equity. We also need to think about private public cooperation in private equity. The private equity market in Europe is not working as efficiently as it should. It should be much stronger. And so central banks should be involved in thinking about private equity for firms. Or alternatively, if this is not what you want to do because you think this is outside of your capabilities, then think about what the Bank of Japan is doing. They have lower capital charges for banks that give loans to firms that come up that are young and have greener technologies. That's an alternative. Go through the banks. But I do think that that central banks can do better than what they're currently doing.